In the summer of 2003, a man lay dying in a hospital bed in Jeddah, Saudi Arabia. No crowds, no flags, no world leaders. The self-styled president for Life of Uganda was slipping away alone, and everything he had built, stolen, and destroyed was catching up with him. His name was Idi Amin Dada. This is the story of his final hours, and the chain of events that brought him there. To understand what Idi Amin became, you have to understand where he came from, because very few men in modern African history rose as dramatically or fell as completely as he did. Born around 1925 in the Koboko district of northwestern Uganda, Amin grew up in poverty, the son of a father who abandoned the family when he was a young child. His mother, a herbalist and healer within the Kakwa ethnic community, raised him largely alone. He received little formal education. By most accounts, he never progressed beyond a primary school level, but what he lacked in schooling, he more than compensated for with physical size, ambition, and a remarkable ability to read the people around him. He joined the King's African Rifles, the British colonial army, in 1946, at roughly 21 years of age. He proved an exceptionally capable soldier. Within years, he had distinguished himself as the light heavyweight boxing champion of Uganda, holding the title for 9 consecutive years from 1951 to 1960. His commanding officers described him as enthusiastic, obedient, and effective, qualities that earned him rapid promotion. By the time Uganda gained independence from Britain in 1962, Amin was one of only a handful of Ugandan officers who had risen to the upper levels of the military. He became close to the country's first prime minister, Milton Obote, a relationship that would prove useful, then dangerous, and ultimately define both of their lives. But beneath the medals and the commanding presence, there was something else entirely. Reports from his early military career describe summary executions and brutal treatment of prisoners during British counterinsurgency operations in the Turkana region of Kenya. The British Army opened an investigation and then quietly buried its findings, concluding that trained Ugandan officers were too valuable to lose. They made a decision they would later have reason to deeply regret. Those early warning signs were not limited to the Turkana operations. Within Uganda's own military, Amin developed a reputation for operating outside established rules, rewarding personal loyalty above everything else, and dealing harshly with anyone he perceived as a rival or a threat. Officers who had served with him in the late 1950s and early 1960s described a man who was charming in public settings and calculating in private ones, someone who remembered slights and repaid them methodically, often long after the original incident had been forgotten by everyone else. By the late 1960s, Amin had risen to commander of the army. He and Obote had grown deeply suspicious of one another. Both men were accumulating power, and both knew the other was doing the same. The tension between them had been building for years. Then, in January 1971, while Obote was abroad attending a Commonwealth conference in Singapore, Amin moved. The coup was swift. Amin's forces seized the radio station, the airport, and key government buildings in Kampala. Within hours, he declared himself head of state. The streets of Kampala, remarkably, initially filled with celebration. Many Ugandans had grown weary of Obote's increasingly authoritarian style, and Amin, with his easy smile and theatrical personality, seemed like a change worth hoping for. Newspapers in the West described him as a gentle giant. The British government recognized his government almost immediately. They had all, catastrophically, misread the man. What followed in the years after the coup would shock the world and set the stage for the slow unraveling that would, decades later, leave him dying in a foreign hospital with no country willing to claim him. Idi Amin ruled Uganda from January 1971 to April 1979. 8 years and 3 months, during which the country was transformed into something it would take generations to recover from. Within weeks of taking power, the killings began. Soldiers from the Asholi and Langi ethnic groups, communities Amin associated with loyalty to the ousted Obote, were the first targets. They were pulled from barracks, taken to remote locations, and killed. Human rights organizations would later estimate that thousands of soldiers were eliminated in the first months of the regime alone. Then came the intelligence apparatus. Amin established the State Research Bureau, an organization that functioned as an internal secret police. Its agents wore civilian clothes, drove unmarked vehicles, and answered directly to Amin. Disappearances became a feature of daily life in Uganda. People were taken from their homes in the early hours of the morning, from their workplaces in broad daylight, from the sides of roads. Most were never seen again. The victims were not chosen at random. Amin moved methodically against anyone he perceived as a potential threat. Politicians, academics, clergy, journalists, tribal leaders, and, increasingly, anyone associated with the ethnic or professional groups he viewed as opposition. The Chief Justice of Uganda, Benedicto Kiwanuka, was taken from his own office in 1972 and killed. The Anglican Archbishop Janani Luwum was murdered in February 1977 after he formally protested the pattern of arbitrary killings occurring across the country. State media reported that he had died in a vehicle accident. The injuries found on his body told a very different story. In 1972, Amin expelled the entire Asian community from Uganda, approximately 80,000 people, many of whose families had lived in the country for 2 or more generations. He gave them 90 days to leave the country with only what they could carry. Their businesses, homes, farms, and properties were seized by the state and handed to regime loyalists, most of whom had no experience managing them. The Ugandan economy, which had depended significantly on Asian-owned commerce and trade, began to unravel within months. Shortages of basic goods spread rapidly. Inflation accelerated. Infrastructure that had taken decades to build began to deteriorate without maintenance or investment. Amin appeared largely indifferent to the economic destruction happening around him. He doubled down on spectacle instead. He awarded himself an ever-growing collection of titles and military decorations, including the Victoria Cross, a British honor he had not earned, and which the British government formally protested. He declared himself the conqueror of the British Empire. He insisted on being ceremonially carried in a chair by British expatriates at a public event, making his political theater visible for all to see. He announced that he had received a message from God instructing him to expel the Asian community. He sent a personal letter to Queen Elizabeth II that, in the words of a British diplomat at the time, defied easy description. The spectacle served a purpose. It was performance designed to distract attention from what was happening in the detention centers, in the forests outside Kampala, and in the facilities operated by the State Research Bureau. While the world watched the theater, Ugandans were living and dying inside the reality it was meant to conceal. The State Research Bureau's headquarters on Nakasero Hill in Kampala became one of the most feared addresses in Uganda. Survivors who passed through its holding cells described conditions of extreme deprivation and systematic abuse. Bodies of those killed there were reportedly disposed of in the Nile and in mass graves in forests outside the capital. The Bureau operated alongside another feared unit, the Public Safety Unit, and between the two organizations, no part of Ugandan society was fully beyond reach. Academics at Makerere University, one of East Africa's most respected institutions, were among those targeted. Several disappeared. Others fled the country entirely, draining Uganda of an entire generation of educated professionals. The international community was largely slow to respond. Early in his rule, Amin had cultivated relationships with several foreign governments, playing them against each other with considerable skill. Libya and the Soviet Union provided military equipment at various points. Israel had initially maintained a cooperative relationship with Amin before he severed it dramatically in 1972 and aligned himself with Palestinian factions. Britain, despite mounting evidence of what was happening inside Uganda, was cautious in its public condemnation for years, partly because of the significant British business interests still operating in the country. It was not until the murder of Archbishop Luwum in 1977, an act too public and too politically significant to be explained away, that international pressure began to build in a more sustained way. Even then, the mechanisms available to outside governments to intervene were limited. Amin was adept at using Uganda's sovereignty as a shield against outside scrutiny. By the late 1970s, estimates of the total death toll from Amin's regime ranged from 100,000 to 500,000 people. Some researchers place the figure higher. The range reflects not uncertainty about whether the killings happened, but the profound difficulty of documenting atrocities committed by a state that actively destroyed its own records as it went. But even regimes built entirely on fear eventually encounter their limits. And for Amin, the beginning of the end came from a direction that almost no one had anticipated. By 1978, Amin's grip on Uganda had begun to loosen in ways he could no longer fully manage. His military, once the foundation of his power, had become faction-ridden, poorly supplied, and increasingly undisciplined. Officers who had once served out of loyalty or calculation were now simply trying to survive the situation around them. Defections were frequent. Morale across the armed forces had collapsed. In October 1978, facing mounting internal pressure and apparently hoping to redirect the anger of his own troops outward, Amin ordered Ugandan forces to invade Tanzania, specifically the Kagera region in the northwest of the country, which he proceeded to declare annexed to Uganda. It was a decision that, viewed from any distance, sealed his fate. Tanzanian President Julius Nyerere, who had spent years providing refuge to Uganda's exiled opposition and had developed no illusions about what Amin represented, responded with decisive and organized force. Tanzanian troops fighting alongside Ugandan exiles organized under the Uganda National Liberation Army crossed into Uganda in early 1979. The campaign was methodical and largely overwhelming. Amin's forces, undermanned and demoralized, could not hold their positions. Town after town fell through the early months of 1979. The Tanzanian advance did not stop. Amin turned to Libya's Muammar Gaddafi for military assistance, and Gaddafi did send a substantial force, several thousand Libyan soldiers deployed to try to slow the advance. It was not enough. The Libyan contingent, unfamiliar with the terrain and without a clear public mandate for the conflict, suffered significant losses near the town of Lukaya in late March 1979 and subsequently withdrew. With Tanzanian and opposition forces converging on Kampala, Amin's circle had already begun to dissolve. Senior officials who had survived by staying close to him were now calculating their own exits. The machinery of the regime, which had operated on fear and personal loyalty to Amin, had no mechanism for functioning without him at its center. On April 11, 1979, Kampala fell. Tanzanian forces and the Ugandan Liberation Army entered the capital. Amin was not there. He had already gone. His first stop was Libya, where Gaddafi, despite the failed military intervention, extended temporary refuge. But that arrangement could not last. Gaddafi had his own political considerations, and sheltering a deposed leader with Amin's record was a liability he was not prepared to carry indefinitely. After a period in Libya, Amin spent time in Iraq before ultimately settling in Saudi Arabia, which agreed to grant him asylum under a specific and non-negotiable condition. He was to remain entirely out of politics and public life, permanently. The Saudis housed him in Jeddah. He was given a residence and a monthly allowance. In exchange, the world was expected to forget him, and largely, it did. The exile years are a story in themselves. 2 decades of a man who could not fully release what he had been, even as the world moved on entirely without him. For 24 years, Idi Amin lived in Saudi Arabia. Not in concealment exactly. His presence in Jeddah was known to those who needed to know, but in a state of enforced irrelevance that must have been, for a man of his particular disposition, its own form of prolonged punishment. He maintained a residence in Jeddah and lived according to a quiet daily routine. He reportedly spent his days praying, occasionally fishing in the Red Sea, reading, and playing the accordion, an instrument he had taken up years earlier and, by some accounts, played with genuine skill. People who encountered him during the exile years described a man who had put on considerable weight since his time as president, who was sociable in personal settings, and who showed no visible signs of guilt or reflection about what had occurred under his rule. No reliable statement of remorse from him has ever been documented from this period. He had multiple wives and a large number of children with him in Saudi Arabia, though the precise count of his children has never been definitively established. Estimates from different sources range from approximately 30 to more than 50. His family lived with him, or nearby, largely shielded from public attention by the Saudi system that surrounded them. There were periodic attempts from various quarters to bring him to some form of account. The Ugandan government under successive administrations called for extradition. International human rights organizations documented his crimes and argued formally and repeatedly for prosecution. Saudi Arabia declined every request, citing the terms of the asylum arrangement, and no international legal mechanism carried sufficient weight to compel a different outcome. On the rare occasions when Amin spoke to journalists during the exile years, he expressed a desire to return to Uganda and spoke of his time in power in terms that had little connection to the documented record. He indicated that he believed his people missed him and that he considered his rule to have brought stability to the country. He showed no recognition of the scale of what had been done under his command. He spoke of Uganda as though it were waiting for him to return. Uganda was not waiting for him. The country had spent the years after 1979 attempting to rebuild from what he had left behind. Successive governments worked through the consequences of destroyed institutions, inflamed ethnic tensions, and a professional class that had been killed or permanently scattered. The State Research Bureau's former detention sites became landmarks of a very different kind, places people remembered and pointed to. Survivors carried the weight of what had happened to them for the rest of their lives. Families who had lost members under his rule had received no explanations, and in most cases, never would. The question of accountability lingered without resolution throughout the exile years. Uganda's transitional justice mechanisms were limited, and with Amin safely beyond any jurisdiction willing to act, the formal legal process that survivors and human rights advocates called for remained out of reach. International bodies could document and condemn, but documentation alone carried no sentence. The gap between what had happened and what had been formally acknowledged before any court remained total, and it remained that way for the entirety of his time in Saudi Arabia. His health, meanwhile, had begun to decline gradually through the 1990s and into the early 2000s. Those who had seen him in his later years in Jeddah described a man considerably diminished from the physically imposing figure he had once been. Heavier, slower, and increasingly withdrawn from even the limited social life he had maintained in his earlier years of exile. Within Uganda, any discussion of Amin returning was met with an unambiguous and consistent response. President Yoweri Museveni, who had himself been part of the liberation forces in 1979, stated publicly on multiple occasions that Amin would face trial on Ugandan soil if he ever returned. It was not an empty statement. It was also, as events unfolded, a moot one. By the early 2000s, Amin's body was failing, and the final chapter of his life would play out not in any courtroom, but in a hospital ward in the same city where he had spent his invisible years. In July 2003, Idi Amin was admitted to King Faisal Specialist Hospital in Jeddah. He was approximately 78 years old. The uncertainty about his exact birth year made even that impossible to state with complete precision. He had been suffering from kidney failure, and on July 18th, he fell into a coma. He never regained consciousness. The final day of his life, August 16th, 2003, passed without ceremony of any kind. There was no deathbed confession placed on record. There were no visits from foreign dignitaries. There were no crowds gathering outside the hospital. His family was present, as was customary, but the wider world remained largely unaware that the end was imminent until it had already come. According to those who were close to him in his final months, Amin remained communicative until near the end, though the progression of kidney failure had taken a severe toll on his body. In the final weeks of his life, members of his family had made contact with Ugandan officials to explore whether he might be allowed to return to Uganda to die on the soil where he had been born. The request was formally denied. The Ugandan government's position remained unchanged. Return meant trial. One of his sons, Jafar Amin, who has spoken on the record about his father in the years since, has confirmed that his father spent much of his remaining time in prayer during those final days. What those prayers contained, whether there was any private reckoning with the hundreds of thousands of lives that were ended or destroyed under his rule, is not something that can be known. No statement emerged from that hospital room, and none was made public. At approximately 9:55 in the morning on August 16, 2003, Idi Amin Dada was pronounced dead after his family made the decision to disconnect life support. The official cause was recorded as multiple organ failure. The response from around the world was notable for its brevity. There were no eulogies from heads of state. The Saudi government confirmed the death in a short official statement. The Ugandan government acknowledged it with equal economy of words. International media covered the story, recounted the broad record of his crimes, and moved on within days. He was buried in Jeddah in a straightforward ceremony conducted according to Islamic rites without state honors. His grave is in the Al-Ruwais cemetery in the city, a fact known but not commemorated. In Uganda, the news landed with complexity. Survivors of his regime received it with a mixture of relief and a particular kind of grief. Relief that he was finally gone, grief that he had never stood trial, that the families of his victims had been denied any formal reckoning, any sentence, any official acknowledgement before the law of what they had been through. For many Ugandans, the quiet death in a Saudi hospital felt like one final evasion by a man who had spent his entire public life evading the consequences of his actions. There were no public ceremonies held in his memory in Uganda. No street was named for him. No official statement acknowledged any contribution. The silence from Kampala on the day of his death was a response in itself. The considered absence of any gesture toward the man who had ruled the country for 8 years and left it in ruin. Some of his relatives in Uganda's northwestern Kakwa region observed private mourning rites, as was customary, but these were family matters, not public ones. Outside Uganda, reactions ranged from brief acknowledgement to complete indifference. In the wider international community, his death registered as a historical footnote, the closing of a chapter that most had considered closed since 1979. The more pressing question, raised again by human rights organizations in the days following his death, was what his passing without trial meant for the survivors still living, and for the broader principle that those who direct mass atrocities against their own populations should face formal accountability, regardless of where they end up. He was gone, but what he had done to Uganda did not go with him, and the question of what to do with that inheritance would outlast him by decades. When Amin fled Uganda in April 1979, he left behind a country that had been systematically taken apart over the course of 8 years. The economy had collapsed. The professional classes, doctors, lawyers, engineers, academics, administrators, had been killed, imprisoned, or driven into permanent exile. The judiciary had been hollowed out. The institutions that had taken years to construct had been gutted or simply ceased to function. Ethnic tensions that his policies had deliberately stoked would take decades to bring to any stable equilibrium. The damage from the expulsion of Uganda's Asian community alone took more than a decade to begin reversing. Most of the businesses seized in 1972 had been run into the ground within years, managed by appointees who had neither the expertise nor the incentive to sustain them. In 1982, the Ugandan government began a formal process to invite the expelled community back and return their properties. The process was slow and incomplete, but it was a public acknowledgement of how severe and deliberate the destruction had been. The human cost is harder to quantify, and the range in the estimates reflects that difficulty honestly. The International Commission of Jurists, Amnesty International, and multiple historical researchers have placed the number of people killed under Amin's rule somewhere between 100,000 and 500,000. Some accounts, drawing on survivor testimony and statements from former members of the regime, suggest the figure may be higher still. What is not in dispute is that the killing was systematic, that it was directed by the state, and that it targeted specific and identifiable groups: soldiers of particular ethnicities, members of professional communities, religious leaders, and anyone the regime identified as opposition. The absence of a formal trial means that the detailed documentary record of these crimes was never assembled and tested before a court. Unlike the proceedings at Nuremberg or the more recent international tribunals convened for Rwanda and the former Yugoslavia, Amin's crimes were never prosecuted. That absence carries real consequences. No official verdict was ever rendered. The historical record rests on survivor testimony, journalistic documentation, and government files, all of it valuable, but not the same as the systematic accounting that a formal legal process produces. His son, Jafar Amin, has argued in interviews and in writing that the historical picture of his father is more layered than the standard record allows, that the documented crimes are real, but that other dimensions of the man deserve acknowledgement alongside them. That perspective has been received critically by human rights organizations and by survivors of the regime, who hold that the scale of what happened is not a matter that complexity can address, and that the documented record stands on its own weight. Idi Amin Dada remains one of the most extensively documented cases of state-directed mass violence in post-colonial African history. His name appears regularly in academic courses on dictatorship, genocide, and transitional justice, alongside figures like Pol Pot, Jean Bedel Bokassa, and Francisco Matías Nguema. The theatrical, self-aggrandizing public persona he constructed, the invented titles, the unearned medals, the absurd public declarations, has sometimes invited a framing of him as a figure of dark absurdity. Scholars and survivors have pushed back consistently against that framing, arguing that the performance was the cover, not the content. The content was the hundreds of thousands of Ugandans who did not survive his rule. The recovery Uganda undertook after 1979 was neither smooth nor linear. Milton Obote, whose removal had initially been welcomed in 1971, returned to power in 1980 after elections that were widely disputed, and his second administration brought its own wave of violence, particularly in the Luwero Triangle north of Kampala, where the government's counterinsurgency campaign against Museveni's National Resistance Army resulted in civilian deaths estimated in the tens of thousands. Uganda was, in other words, a country that had suffered multiple consecutive waves of state-directed violence, each building on the institutional and social damage left by the one before it. Amin had not simply caused one chapter of destruction, he had set conditions that made subsequent violence easier and more likely. The formal process of accounting for Amin's era remained incomplete decades after his death. No Truth and Reconciliation Commission specifically addressed his rule. No dedicated memorial was established at a national level. The documentation gathered by human rights organizations, historians, and journalists exists, but it has never been formally recognized by the Ugandan state in the way that, for example, Rwanda formalized its own reckoning with the 1994 genocide. The gap between what happened and what has been officially acknowledged in Uganda remains significant. A silence that speaks to how difficult it is for any society to fully confront the scale of what was done to it, particularly when the man responsible died beyond its reach and beyond its law. He died in a hospital bed in Jeddah without facing a single day of legal proceedings. He was buried without ceremony, and the country he had left in ruins continued, long after the news of his death had passed from the front pages, the slow and painful work of deciding what it means to remember, and what it costs not to. If you enjoyed this video, please like and subscribe to our channel so you never miss out on more history documentaries.